welcome to Free Speech TV. My name is Carl Nagin. I'm here at the 2018 Bioneers Conference, and my guest is one of the plenary speakers. And I've been coming to Bioneers for many years, but I have to say that our guest here is one of the most extraordinary scientific minds that I have ever heard speak. Her name is Monica Gagliano. She is an associate professor in evolutionary ecology in Australia. And she is on the forefront of a kind of a revolution in scientific thinking around the question of plant cognition. And she's going to talk to us about this question of whether plants have or exhibit behavior that resembles consciousness or echoes consciousness, or if that's the wrong word, she's going to help us through that world. She's also spent a lot of time in the Amazonian jungle with Amazonian shamans, and she's going to talk to us about that experience as well. Monica, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, good. So I want to pick up on something. Actually, I'd like to start with a passage that I read in your new book, which is this book here. It's called "Thus Spoke the Plant." That has a certain echo. I know another book called "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," but I've never heard about plants speaking. So
the echo is correct.
The echo is correct. Thank you. Well, I'd like you to echo something from this wonderful book. If you wouldn't mind reading a passage from it to us, and if you would just take this, because it's a perception, it's a thought that maybe can spark a conversation here about your work.
I never read my own book.
Oh, good.
Actually, I don't think I've ever read my book. So we'll see.
It read you.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so throughout human history, we have constructed boundaries to define reality in an attempt to soothe our need to feel safe in our own skin and at home in a world we are fundamentally so afraid of. Threatening the very thing they promise to protect, our feeling of being safe, these boundaries are, and always were, fictional walls that restrict our understanding of who we truly are and that replace clear seeing with misconception, the illusion that we need to control a world we have no control over. Our need to feel safe, and correspondingly the feeling of not being safe, in the world seems inextricably linked to our need to control it. But what if we were to realize that the only reason we feel unsafe in the world is because we believe we need to control it? As the sacred jungle tobacco would teach me a year later, we have no control over the circumstances that face us until we surrender the need to control them. As long as we need to control our circumstances, we also need to feel unsafe and insecure about them, because the two states are bound together in a self-perpetuating and irreconcilable loop that goes something like this. We try to control because we feel unsafe and believe that by controlling our world, we will still feel safe in it, and yet we never do. And we cannot feel safe in the world if we keep believing that the world needs controlling, because without our control, there is something unsafe about it.
Thank you, Monica. That's wonderful. In reading this perception or this insight comes at a time when you're in the Amazonian jungle, if I'm not mistaken, and you're doing research there on what?
Well, it sounds like that must have been the Ayauma, which
yes.
is a big tree that is also known, like the moniker for the tree is the cannonball tree,
yes.
And which of course I didn't know at the time. And yeah, and it's a strange tree in a way, because it's so unusual in the way in which the fruit really do look like cannonballs. And the moniker comes from the fact that when the fruit is ready and the tree is ready to let it go, the fruit drops to the ground and it smashes to the ground with this big noise, which sounds like a cannonball. But what it was interesting for me as a parallel in my own life at the time, I realized that sometimes, in the case of the tree, for example, the fruit is only released when it's ready. It doesn't drop it earlier or later, only when it's perfectly the right time. And so, and then it will open, and then it's, you know, ready to spread the seeds and do its job as a fruit. And for me, it became very clear that, yeah, timing of things is crucial. Only when it's really the right time and you're ready for that time, things will happen and can happen in the right way. And too early or too late is out of sync with what is needed. So it was is a good tree.
Your interactions as an experimental scientist and botanist working in the Peruvian Amazon and other places, you interact with your subject matter, I think, in a perhaps different way than most scientists do. And that you didn't start off with plants, you started off with animals. You made the switch into botany. And your observations and writing about plants have to do with plant behavior and plant cognition. What led you to this really uncharted territory of scientific research?
Well, as you correctly pointed out, I'm an animal ecologist by training. And actually, I don't consider myself a botanist because I really feel I don't know anything about plants in the way a botanist would know plants. But what I do is I bring my approach that is from an animal ecological perspective, and I just redeploy it onto the plants. And that is not to say that I'm seeing plants as animals, but the frameworks and the kind of questions and the way in which we approach the questions and the processes that we are looking for suddenly became very clear that they can be deployed anywhere, whether the plants, the animal, or anything. So that is really what has been guiding my work in that sense. That is like some of the, when you're talking about behavior or when you talk about cognition, these are realms that belong to the animal world. And traditionally we see them as belonging to the animal world. So I guess some of the controversial aspect is simply because we are not used to use this kind of concept and look at these kind of processes in a context that is outside the traditional one. But it doesn't mean that those processes don't operate in other contexts.
Is that because traditional science has a kind of negative bias, or perhaps an a priori idea about anthropocentric notions of what mind is, what consciousness is? Is that part of the
I think that it's even simpler than that. Like, definitely that is one of the layers, but there is a very simple issue, and it's time, again, time scale. And I think the main problem that we have as humans observing others of different forms is their movement or lack of. So, and there's been beautiful study in neuroscience where they show that if I place you in front of a TV and I show you an image of a human running, in your brain you will be running, right? And then if they replace the image, the little movie of the human running, and it will be a robotic, like a humanoid, so a robot designed to resemble a human, and then is the robot running in the video, your brain will not make a difference, because the movement is so similar that for your brain, you're running as well, for the mirror neurons. And so you can see that the brain doesn't distinguish the form as such. It distinguishes, and it's very, this is how our brain works, it's very focused on movement. And of course it's very advantageous for an animal that need to see things moving, both for protecting itself and potentially to catch things for food. And so from that perspective, as an animal species, we are totally, perfectly aligned with what we are supposed to be doing and adapted for that. The problem arises when then we encounter difficulties in recognizing different movements and different forms. So the further away you go from the human form and the human kind of movement, the less your brain can recognize that movement.
How has that informed the way you observe plants?
Exactly, that's the problem, isn't it? Because the further away from the human time scale of moving you go, the harder it is for ourselves to connect with that beingness and that form. And so, as you can imagine, plants move at a totally different time scale from us, and either they're too fast or they're too slow. And so when you trying to see a plant with the eyes of an animal, you see it as totally fixed and immobile.
Static.
Exactly. And that feeling and that perception actually then translate into, oh, something that doesn't move is like an object that doesn't move. Therefore, objects don't have any subjectivity, they don't have agency, they don't have cognition, consciousness, and that's when it escalates into other realms.
But your work has established that plants have memory.
Definitely.
Or they seem to have memory. They seem to be able to make decisions.
Yep.
Can you give me some examples of that?
Yeah,
That's
sure.
extraordinary.
Well, actually, the concept of memory and learning in plants is not new, so I wouldn't claim that to myself. For at least 100 years, but probably more, other scientists, famous scientists, Bose and Darwin himself, have tried to demonstrate that plants must be able to learn and remember, but I guess they never managed to do it experimentally. The demonstration never arrived. So it was like one of those hunches that scientists get all the time. And then the process for us is to translate that into, okay, where is the data? And so in a way, because so many have tried and no data followed, no proper experimental data followed, then science tends to dismiss then. It's like, well, obviously you tried, it didn't work, you can't provide the data, so it doesn't exist. But that's an assumption. That step is an assumption. And so I guess when I rediscovered this, the advantage that I had was that I was coming from an animal ecological perspective, where this kind of question and this kind of experimentally, this kind of question had been addressed for so many different species of different form and shape and movements. And so, but fundamentally the question is supported by a specific framework which we can deploy, as I said before, anywhere. And so if the plants put in the right condition, is ticking the boxes, whether it was a plant or an animal, then to me it doesn't matter anymore. I'm looking at the process, and the process of learning, which of course includes memory in it as part of it. If you tick in the boxes, you're learning.
What did you observe, but specifically, let's make this specific, where did you and how did you discover this about plant memory, or what was it that you found? Where did you do this?
Yeah, the first place where I started, because of this problem with movement and time, I picked on one of the species of plants. We actually kind of transcend that issue. Okay. And so I used Mimosa pudica, which was like, Mimosa's been famous for millennia. Like, it's been written about her forever and ever. And of course also Darwin loved it and played with it. And the reason why it's so attractive to us as the human animal is because Mimosa moves at our time. And is the plant that is also known as the sensitive plant. And is the plant that if you touch it, it will close the leaves immediately. So you can see it, And that also, aside from bridging this gap between the animal movement and the plant movement, or the animal world and the plant world, it also allows for an easy experiment to be done. And so there was a behavior that I could quantify and observe, literally. And so Mimosa was the starter, and what I did, and the experiment is now a few years old, and it was made famous as well by Michael Pollan, who wrote about it in the New Yorker. And so basically, to make the story very simple, I was dropping Mimosa because Mimosa, or any plant really, is not used to be dropped randomly. So I created this setup where I could literally drop the plant in a controlled way. And of course, the first few times, Mimosa closes its leaves, because the closure of the leaves is a defensive mechanism, as a protective response. And so if you don't know what's happening, it's good news that you know that you can protect yourself, right? Yes. So Mimosa will close the leaves. But as you continue dropping the plant, after very little time actually, the plant realizes that actually nothing bad follows.
No big deal.
This. Exactly. So what I was testing was exactly that. Can the plants realize that there is nothing following this drop that is actually vital? There is no risk for your life. There is nothing of survival value here, and so would you ignore it? Because the problem with not ignoring it, like when mimosa closes the leaves, if it cannot feed on light as efficiently. Something like 40% of the photosynthetic efficiency drops. So then there is a trade-off between protect yourself and close. If the threat is real, it's a good idea. But if the threat is not real, you are closing your leaves and cutting off your feeding time for nothing.
So, decision making.
Mimosa decides. Yeah, decides definitely. That is when, after a little bit of experience, the plant realizes that there is no consequences to the drop and chooses not to close its leaves, even while I keep dropping it.
That's extraordinary. So now we're going to move to another phase of this, which is how this work in these observations, this kind of experimental science, call it that.
It is.
Okay. Was received by your colleagues.
Ooh. Mimosa was the first one.
Yeah.
And well, I mean,
within the scientific community.
Obviously, there was a lot of resistance.
Right.
And which I was very naive. I didn't really expect it at first.
Right.
So it caught me by surprise.
Right.
Because I remember, and actually that was the conference where Michael Pollan reported. I remember going to the conference and presenting the results. And I remember on purpose, this was a scientific conference on plants, and I remember on purpose not putting in my presentation any discussion of the results. Because I thought, oh, it's going to be great. I'll present the results. People, like my colleagues, are going to get excited about this, and we can discuss it. And but no.
They're arguing the very premise of your work.
Yeah, it was like, it was actually quite interesting, like from a social science perspective, right. To see some of the reaction, which went from aggressive to plainly rude and,
dismissive.
But from people that, these are high-standing academics. There's nothing threatening their position except a little plant.
But threatening their imagination, that's another question.
Possibly,
That's another question. So I want to go to this word imagination, which is one that you used in your plenary talk at Bioneers a lot. And you describe it as a door and a bridge at the same time, a bridge between heart and mind, and a door that we spend a lot of time fearing to enter. And I think you were, if I'm reading your talk correctly, you were using this in a way as a metaphor for the kind of resistance that you encountered in the science world. And you advocated strongly and passionately for going through that door. Let's talk about imagination in science and what role, not only in science, but in the scheme of things. Do plants have imagination?
Well, again, it's one of those words that, like many others, like consciousness, intelligence, and all sorts, it's loaded because it's, first of all, is a word that we as humans have created, and therefore we are also creating the meaning for it, and these meanings keep changing. And now the root of the word, coming from Latin, is literally about create image of something or represent something. And so if we take that meaning, another experiment that I did with the peas could be interpreted exactly like that. The peas were put through a Pavlovian experiment, which is exactly the same as the Pavlov's dog. And so the peas, like the dog, was presented with some dinner. In the case of the plants, of course, is light. And then there was a signal that is totally neutral, which means it doesn't mean anything to the plant or the dog. In the case of the dog was a bell, in my case was a fan. And then when this neutral signal is associated, so it's presented together with dinner, both the plant and the dog activate their expectation when just the neutral signal, which was neutral and now has acquired meaning, is presented alone. So in the case of my plants, by the time they had a bit of training and they realized that this fan always precedes my light, which is dinner, by the time the fan is presented alone, never followed by the light, the plants will bend towards it as if it's expecting light to come after it. And for that to happen, it means that the plant is, well, first of all, is detecting the signals, is categorizing them depending on what values they have. So there is an internal value established, which is of course subjective because it depends on which experience the plant is having, like individually as a plant. And then from there, the fact that a plant is expecting something that is not in its environment, in a way, is the same as saying that the food, the light that is not present, is an idea in the mind of the plant. So the plant is imagining the arrival of something that is not there.
So we're moving from decision making now into a very complex, what in the human world we would call a fairly complex kind of thinking, imagining. That's extraordinary. So you have also done work in terms of plant acoustics. Could you describe some of that?
Yeah, well, actually, that was the original place where I started with plants.
Okay.
My work on learning and memory became like the steps that follow the initial start on plant communication. And coming from the animal perspective, again, when I started looking at plants, of course, I went into the literature and I looked at if there was anything there in terms of plant behavior and specifically communication. And I was pleasantly surprised because there was quite a lot of beautiful science there in relation to how plants use chemicals to communicate with each other, which now is like well known. They use light, of course, to work out who is growing next to them and what the other is doing and what is the appropriate response at a given time. And then, of course, contact. And we know that especially with the roots, that they can decide whether it's a situation where they should compete for resources and space or actually not. Actually, it's
cooperate.
Good and cooperation is the way to go. So I started looking at those studies and thinking, like, wow, I didn't know that plants could do all these things. I wonder what else they can do. And again, in the animal world, sound, as you can hear, is one of the things that pervades all the environments, and many organisms in one way or another can use part of the sound spectrum. And some, like us, have a specific zone which we call the
hearing range, or
yeah, exactly. While some other animals might use the same zone or wider areas. Like you think of your dog, he can hear much more than we do, but we also know the example of the elephants using very low infrasounds to communicate a long distance. Whales,
owls,
bats and dolphins on the other extreme. So there is a nice spectrum there, and I was just wondering, like, if you're an animal, again, movement, you can move if something is alerting you that something is not right, and sound usually is a good signal to alert. But if you're a plant and you are moving much slower in time, then you must be even more sensitive to those cues because you don't really have the time to uproot and go. So the best strategy, if you were a plant, would be to be sensitive and respond even more quickly than an animal, if anything, and more fine-tuned to those signals. So when I looked into the literature, of course you find all sorts of crazy stuff on sound and plant in terms of like, oh yeah, playing music to the plants,
sing to plants,
all of that. But that crazy literature, aside from the folklore from the more recent times, if you go a little bit back in time and then you look into the literature from the anthropologists, you realize that actually this story is a story that has a long history. And this idea that us humans have somehow communicated with sound with plants, or plants have sung to us and all of that, it's a story that it's in our heritage.
Yes.
And so I was wondering whether, just purely as a scientist, like, well, here is something that obviously natural selection hasn't removed yet. So either it's just like maladaptive, like we really like the story and we're going to keep it even if it serves nothing, or the alternative is the obvious. It's like, well, maybe it is adaptive and maybe we are keeping this story because there is something to it. And I wonder simply if we as, our modern version of ourselves have kind of either forgotten or we don't know how to do it anymore. But would plants actually produce sounds, and has anybody actually checked? and would we hear it, and all of those questions. So I started exploring in this way, and of course.
What were the first plants you worked with in
it
this
was
work?
corn, actually.
Corn,
which of course is a very important plant for indigenous people here.
Mesoamerica.
And, exactly. Yes. And then of course I ended up following some footsteps down to the southern part of the Americas, and I ended up in the Amazon, where these ideas is still nice and alive.
Yes.
And the shamans in the Amazon, and not only them but many others in many other cultures do it, but they were the example that really stuck up for me, and they happily tell you, there's like, yeah, the plant sings to me, and then if I'm connected with the plant properly, and if I'm a good student, the plant will teach me its song, and then that song is medicine that I will use to heal my people. And so this concept that of course for our Western mind is totally like, okay, exactly. But I was like, well, you know, I'm just gonna go and see what's in there. And so of course you have to immerse yourself in that space and see really what's there. For me, I realize now that was, to me, is objective science. It's like you're going and you're testing an hypothesis. And if the only way to test it is by putting yourself in the picture, you do. And so
you allowed your subjectivity then to enter into your work.
Exactly. And of course, what I found was something that would change everything, because suddenly I could have those experiences that the shamans was talking about, and I could understand literally, but experientially, what they were talking about, and I can also understand why our words are failing us when we're trying to describe these processes, because it's not that you're really literally hearing a plant singing to you, but there is definitely communication, and it's the closest thing. It's almost like silent acoustics. I don't even know how to describe it, because it sounds like, but it's not a sound.
Well, here's an important question. Is it impossible to measure that sound through the kinds of machines that we use, tape recorders, whatever? Is it, what is it, the uncertainty principle, that where what we perceive is a result of the means with which we are looking at it.
Yeah.
So you're allowing yourself to be the tool to receive whatever messages the plant. Now this is, I can see, for empirical Western science would be anathema. You're opening the door to the subjective element, which
but
scientists...
I didn't stop there.
You didn't stop there, no. So what did you do then?
So that was the beginning. I needed to observe.
Yes.
Which is the beginning of science anyway. You need to observe something, and then you go and create an experimental design that allows you to test what you observed and see whether it's really what you think it is or not. And so you create your hypotheses and you test them. Correct. And so then I was able to bring this experience and see, like, exactly what you asked. Have we got any ways of testing this? Is there any way that we can actually really experimentally and scientifically test whether plants produce sound? And when you test it, what you find is the answer is yes. And not only they produce their own sound, which we can detect, but also they are detecting sound from their environment, which make total sense. And they're responding selectively to certain sounds that are of interest to them. And so at the beginning, I started with corn, and I collaborated with colleagues in the UK they are really the acoustic experts in the study, because they were looking at acoustic in terms of animals, and specifically small insects, which are really fiddly to work with as well. And so we use exactly the same equipment, which is laser vibrometry. So it's a very fancy word, and it's a very big machines, and it requires a lot of care, because we had to work in, sound protected environments, so that we didn't get interference from the outside, and on soundproof systems, right? But what we found is like, yeah, the plants are emitting their own sound, and they're the one that we looked at have the sounds are coming through a specific frequency, which is actually within our audio range. But of course, the amplitude, so the volume, is low, and so we can't hear it.
Many species of corn. Have you looked at the question of whether different kinds of corn have different? But you're going there.
It would be nice, isn't it? It's like a culture.
Well, the reason I ask is there are mammal biologists who have looked at the blue whales and their music. And one of the things they found is I think there are 13 or so different pods around the world specific to regions, and they have their own idioms.
Yep.
Their sound of the blue whale in the Indian Ocean is different from other places. That's extraordinary.
And what is even better is that there was probably from the same group of people that you have read that what they did as well, they recorded how when these different groups meet, they exchange songs. And the catchy tune, because the males are the one making them, the catchy tune is like just our pop songs, our pop music in our culture. Like the catchy tune is the one that then the other group learn, and then they all go and sing the catchy tune of the time until they develop their own again and they become separate again, and then they.
So there's a top 10 of whales.
Exactly,
whale
something like that. So it would be cool or interesting to know whether plants could do the same.
Thank you, Monica Gagliano, for your beautiful work and for being with us on Free Speech TV.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.